Okay, this seminar is on co-evolutionary perspectives on the technosphere, which means we are trying to look at the emergence of the technosphere through a long evolutionary process, and we also are deploying perspectives that come from both history as well as evolutionary theory to understand what intricate processes led to the emergence of what we now call the technosphere. Generally, in discussions about the technosphere and the notion of sphere, where it sort of implies that it's sort of a layer of spheres from the geosphere, atmosphere, biosphere, technosphere. But what we are really interested in exploring is how those various dimensions came about through evolutionary processes, sort of the construction of the technosphere. And what an evolutionary perspective also allows us to then assess is basically the possibilities and constraints of future change. And our argument is we can only get at this really if we understand the origin and the dynamics that lead to the technosphere.
So we want to understand what we can do about it, how we can shape it, and what powers of intervention still is with humans, even though the planetary environment has grown ever more technical and ever more, self-regulating. But we believe that there are still dimensions for human interventions, and we want to identify those dimensions.
What I think that we offer in this seminar is an attempt to kind of unwind a bit the idea, a fixed idea of what the technosphere is or might become, and instead to think about it in a much longer term and dynamic manner.
I think this seminar, in a way, is very emblematic for what the whole campus is trying to do. So largely we brought together a whole range of different perspectives that will add to the multiple intersecting exploratory dimensions. So we have a perspective that is grounded in evolutionary theory. We have another perspective that is grounded in deep history and the history of knowledge as well as the history of society, including getting a lot of evidence from archaeology, from the history of technology, from the history of science. We then have added an interesting comparative dimension that we are looking at it from multiple perspectives, sort of a more traditional scientific Western perspective, but then also bringing in alternatives that are grounded more in a Japanese Eastern tradition to get different vantage points on that problem. Which then brings us to a question about what to do, the future, the imaginaries of the technosphere, including about how we actually can govern the technosphere or can actually design transformations inside of the technosphere. So I think in that way, this seminar main emphasis is in the collision of all those different perspectives and what happens.
I think the seminar is also an exercise in critical thinking, because we do not just take any of the concepts that we are dealing with for granted. Normally when, in a university course, it very often happens that, you're confronted with a paradigm and then you learn the details and you try to fit the details together as if they were pieces of a puzzle. But in this case, this cannot be done. We have a problem that if we accept it in the way that it is stated in the given concept, is an unsolvable problem. So we have to rethink the concepts in such a way that it may leave room for interventions. And therefore the very concept of the technosphere, which comes from a system theoretical perspectives, needs to be to some degree undone. It's a very suggestive, very important concept, but still we need to rethink it in a critical way. And I think that's can only be done in such an open environment as in this seminar.
Yes, I think the question for me is, what are the sources of knowledge, existing sources of knowledge, that we can use to do this thing that Jürgen has just mentioned, to explore this content, this idea of the technosphere, to undo the idea of the technosphere a bit. And so I hope that in the seminar we will begin to present a few examples of real existing knowledges that have been perhaps not so easily accessible to date, but that with a much longer term, a much more dynamic, a co-evolutionary perspective, become, we can say, not exactly ready-made. They don't present any easy answers, but at least they give you some clues of ways to begin to conduct this reimagination.
For me, the term technosphere is, it covers not only the so-called technology, but also it covers the field of institution. So I think it might deal with not only the human behavior or human thing, but also it can deal with the animal or plants or other living being. So it can bridge the ecological thing and also the history. So it will be the real challenge for our thinking.